I think it can be very easy to write Peter off and say something like, clearly, you did not listen to the first reading from the 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time, otherwise you would have known that God is not in the wind, he is not in the storm. And obviously, Peter, what are you thinking? God doesn't come to us in the giant storm in the wind, right? And it's easy to say, almost with Jesus here, oh, you have little faith, why did you doubt? But the word that Jesus uses for little in the phrase little faith is probably not exactly what we say when we are writing Peter off and we say, you have little faith. The word that Jesus uses when he says, you have little faith, rather than speaking of a quantity or a size, he's speaking of a duration. So rather than saying, you whose faith is tiny in size, he's rather saying, you whose faith is short in duration. And I think with this lens, we understand a lot of Peter's life, because Peter is actually a very good example of how we are to pray. Peter is very, very bold in all of his statements throughout the gospel. Just think of this encounter. Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. I don't know if I would have had the faith to say that, the courage to say that. And then as he's beginning to sink, what does he cry out? Lord, save me. He knows that Christ is the only source of our salvation. So rather than say, Peter, your faith is very, very tiny in size, Jesus is commenting, Peter, you could have stayed with me the whole time. Why was your faith short in duration? And I'll do a brief segue. I promise I'll connect it in a little bit. But in the first reading, we hear another adjective, and the adjective is tiny. After the wind and the earthquake and the fire, God comes to Elijah in this tiny whispering voice. And that word tiny does not refer to duration, but rather to size, right? It's this small murmuring, this gentle underlying presence that God is there with us. And so we want this tiny sound, but we don't want this smallness, this littleness of duration, right? And so I think the prayer that we can offer today is, Lord, you are always with us in presence. It's not always in the giant wind, in the earthquake, in the fire, but your presence is with us in this small murmuring sound. Please show me where that is in my daily life. And what better example do we have of Christ's presence in a tiny whispering way than in the Mass and in the Eucharist, right? So Christ does not come to us in the Eucharist with thunder and rocks and fire, but he comes to us in a very humble means. What appears to be bread and wine is actually the body and blood of Christ. And this tiny whispering presence that is constant is what can carry us through the rest of the week. So we can be very bold with Peter, especially in the confessional. Lord, if it is you, command that I come to you on this water. Lord, save me. And we can also be very humble like Elijah and recognize Christ in the small whisperings of our daily life. Amen.